The gunfire had stopped 3 minutes ago, but Lieutenant Commander Sarah Ghost Reeves could still taste cordite in the air as she pressed her back against the concrete wall of the abandoned warehouse. Blood seeped through the tactical vest, covering her left shoulder, warm and sticky against her skin. The silence felt wrong, too complete, too final. In her 7 years as a Navy SEAL, she'd learned that silence after a firefight usually meant one of two things: victory or a trap. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. This felt like a trap. Through the cracked window beside her, she could see the bodies of her teammates scattered across the courtyard like broken dolls. Martinez lay face down near the rusted shipping container, his rifle still clutched in his hands. Thompson had made it almost to the extraction point before a sniper's bullet found him. Even from this distance, she could see the dark pool spreading beneath his motionless form. Her earpiece crackled with static, then nothing. Command had gone silent 20 minutes ago, right around the time everything went to hell. The mission was supposed to be routine: infiltrate the compound, extract the asset, and disappear before dawn. Instead, they'd walked straight into an ambush that felt choreographed, like the enemy had been reading their playbook. Sarah's fingers trembled as she checked her sidearm. 3 rounds left. Not nearly enough if they came looking for survivors. Which they would. They always did. Dr. Vasquez was somewhere in this facility, and Sarah intended to find her. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was the sophisticated early warning systems, the professional military tactics of the guards, or the fact that someone had fed their entire operational plan to the enemy. Sarah had noticed the signs during their approach guard rotations that seemed to anticipate their movements, defensive positions that covered exactly the routes they'd planned to use. She'd tried to signal her concerns to Lieutenant Hayes, her team leader, but by then, it was too late. The first explosion had torn through their entry point before Hayes could even respond to her hand signals. Now Hayes was dead, along with Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez. 6 of the finest soldiers she'd ever served with, reduced to casualties because someone had sold them out. The thought burned in her chest like acid, mixing with the physical pain from her wound and the metallic taste of fear. A door slammed somewhere in the compound, followed by voices speaking in Dari and Arabic. They were conducting a sweep, room by room, looking for survivors. Sarah estimated she had maybe 5 minutes before they reached her position. 5 minutes to figure out how to complete a mission that had been doomed from the start. She thought about Dr. Vasquez, probably locked in some basement laboratory, unaware that her rescue attempt had just cost 6 lives. The mission profile had described her as brilliant but naive, a researcher who'd gotten in over her head with the wrong people. Sarah wondered if the doctor even knew there had been a rescue attempt, or if she'd spend the rest of her life wondering why no one had come for her. The voices were getting closer. Sarah could distinguish at least 3 different speakers, their boots echoing off the concrete walls as they moved methodically through the building, professional, disciplined. These weren't the usual ragtag militants they typically faced in this region. Whoever was running this operation had access to serious training and equipment. Sarah reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a small digital device, a signal booster that could amplify her radio transmission for about 30 seconds before burning out. It was emergency equipment, designed for exactly this kind of situation. She had one chance to get a message through to command. Assuming command wasn't compromised too. As she powered up the device, her mind raced through the possibilities. How had the enemy known their exact approach routes, their timing? Even their emergency extraction points seemed to be covered by sniper positions. Someone with access to classified operational details had betrayed them, but who? And more importantly, were other teams walking into similar traps? The signal booster came online with a faint electronic whine. Sarah pressed the transmit button. and whispered urgently into her throat mic, "Ghost to control. Phoenix team is down. Repeat, Phoenix team is down. Mission compromised. Recommend abort all related operations." Someone's feeding intel to the device sparked and died, its circuits overloaded from the power surge. Sarah stared at the dead equipment, hoping her message had gotten through, knowing it probably hadn't. The voices outside were closer now. Perhaps one room away. She could hear them speaking in low, professional tones, coordinating their search pattern with the kind of tactical discipline that came from serious military training. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to center herself, drawing on years of meditation and mental conditioning that had gotten her through Hell Week and countless missions since. When she opened them again, she was Ghost, not the woman who'd grown up in small-town Ohio dreaming of adventure, but the operator who'd earned her nickname by moving through enemy territory like a specter, completing objectives that others thought impossible. The wound in her shoulder throbbed, but it wasn't life-threatening. She'd had worse during training exercises. What mattered now was getting to Dr. Vasquez and extracting her, not just to complete the mission, but to make sure her teammates' deaths hadn't been meaningless. 6 good soldiers had died tonight, and their sacrifice deserved better than failure. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of movement near the main building, guards taking positions around what she assumed was the laboratory complex. They moved with the kind of confidence that came from knowing they held all the advantages. They thought the threat was neutralized, that they could return to their normal security posture. They were wrong. Sarah began stripping off her tactical gear, keeping only the essential items she could conceal. The enemy uniform she'd noticed on one of the guards earlier would be her way in. It was a desperate plan, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only option she had left. Sometimes the most audacious approach was the one no one expected. As she prepared to move, Sarah found herself thinking about her sister's wedding next month, an event she'd promised to attend, despite the complicated relationship with her family. Her parents still didn't entirely understand why she'd chosen the military over the engineering degree they'd paid for, or why she'd insisted on joining the SEALs when safer options were available. They saw her choice as rebellion rather than service, never understanding that this wasn't about proving something to the world, but about answering a calling that had defined her since childhood. The voices outside had moved past her position, continuing their sweep toward the far end of the building. Sarah counted to 30, then began moving toward the door. She'd noticed the guard post near the laboratory entrance during their reconnaissance, and she had a good memory for faces and uniform details. If she could get close enough to take out a guard quietly, she might be able to walk right into the complex wearing their colors. It was the kind of plan that sounded insane when spoken aloud, but sometimes insane was exactly what the situation required. Sarah had built her reputation on doing the impossible, on finding ways to complete missions when everything had gone wrong. Tonight would be the ultimate test of that reputation. As she cracked open the door and peered into the corridor beyond, Sarah whispered a prayer for her fallen teammates and made a promise to Dr. Vasquez. She was coming, and nothing would stop her from bringing the doctor home. The corridor stretched, a head like a throat waiting to swallow her whole. Sarah moved along the wall, her boots silent on the concrete floor, despite the debris scattered from the earlier explosions. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every corner could be her last. But she'd been trained for this, to move through hostile territory like a ghost, to become one with the darkness that others feared. The wound in her shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the muscle felt tight and unresponsive. She tested her range of motion carefully, confirming she could still aim accurately despite the injury. Pain was temporary. Failure was permanent. That had been drilled into her during the grueling months of SEAL training, where instructors had pushed her beyond every limit she thought she had. The memory of earning her place among the SEALs gave her strength now as she approached the end of the corridor. The memory gave her strength, Now as she approached the end of the corridor, through a grimy window she could see the main courtyard where her teammates' bodies still lay. The sight hit her like a physical blow, threatening to overwhelm her with grief and rage. But she pushed those emotions down, storing them in the locked compartment of her mind where she kept all the things that could compromise her mission effectiveness. There would be time to mourn later. Right now she had a job to finish. Sarah reached the exit and paused, listening for movement outside. The compound had settled into what appeared to be a normal security routine, with guards resuming their regular patrols now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. She could hear footsteps on gravel, the occasional radio check-in, the sound of someone lighting a cigarette. Normal sounds that meant they felt safe. She was about to change that. The guard post she'd identified during reconnaissance sat about 50 meters away, positioned to monitor both the laboratory entrance and the main gate. A single sentry manned the position, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, nervously smoking while watching the perimeter. His uniform was clean and properly maintained, suggesting he was part of a professional military unit rather than a hastily recruited militia. Sarah studied his equipment and bearing, noting the way he held his rifle, the positioning of his gear, the subtle details that would help her impersonate him if she could take his place. The uniform would be slightly too large. He was taller and broader than she was, but in the darkness, with the right posture and confidence, she might be able to pass for him long enough to reach the laboratory. Moving from cover to cover, she worked her way around the perimeter of the courtyard, avoiding the pools of light cast by the security floods. Her injured shoulder protested with each movement, sending sharp spikes of pain through her upper body, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. She'd endured worse during training exercises designed to simulate exactly this kind of scenario. Guard was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested this was his first real combat assignment. He kept checking his watch, probably counting down the minutes until his relief arrived. That nervousness would work in her favor. Nervous guards were more likely to see threats where none existed, but they were also more likely to panic when actually confronted with danger. Sarah positioned herself in the shadows behind the guard post, close enough to smell the tobacco smoke from his cigarette. She could hear him muttering to himself in what sounded like Dari, possibly a prayer or maybe just the nervous chatter of someone trying to stay alert during a long watch. Either way, it meant he wasn't entirely focused on his surroundings. Drew her combat knife, its blade darkened to prevent reflection. This part never got easier, even after 7 years in the teams. Taking a life in the heat of battle was one thing. There was adrenaline, immediate threat, the clear dynamics of kill or be killed. But this kind of cold, calculated killing required a different part of herself, the part she sometimes worried might be growing too large. The guard turned slightly, and she could see his profile in the dim light. He really was just a kid, probably conscripted or recruited with promises of steady pay and adventure. Under different circumstances, he might have been studying at university or working in his father's shop. Instead, he was standing guard at a facility where innocent people were being held against their will. Sarah reminded herself of Dr. Vasquez, locked somewhere in that laboratory complex, forced to use her knowledge to create weapons that would kill innocent people. She thought of her teammates lying dead in the courtyard, their families who would soon receive visits from casualty notification officers. Sometimes the right thing required terrible choices. She moved like her nickname suggested, silent, invisible, deadly. The guard never knew she was there until her hand clamped over his mouth and the knife found the gap between his ribs. He struggled for a moment, his eyes wide with terror and confusion, then went limp. Sarah lowered his body carefully to the ground, already beginning to strip off his uniform. The enemy uniform felt alien against her skin, the fabric coarser than she was used to, carrying the scent of unfamiliar soap and nervous sweat from its previous occupant. Sarah had adjusted the straps and buckles as much as possible, But the uniform was still too large in the shoulders and too long in the legs. She'd rolled up the cuffs and stuffed padding into the shoulders, but anyone looking closely would notice. The ill fit, fortunately. She wasn't planning on anyone looking closely. As she walked toward the laboratory complex, rifle slung casually across her shoulder in the manner she'd observed from the other guards, Sarah's mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with her sister 3 weeks ago. Emma had called while Sarah was preparing for this deployment, excited about her upcoming wedding and desperate for her older sister's approval of the venue. The dress, the flowers, all the details that seemed monumentally important to Emma, but utterly foreign to Sarah. "I know you don't get it," Emma had said during that call, her voice carrying the slight edge of frustration that had defined their relationship since childhood. "You've never cared about any of this stuff. But it matters to me, Sarah. It matters to me that you'll be there, that you'll try to understand why this is important." Sarah had promised to attend Emma's wedding next month, a commitment that now seemed impossibly distant. She'd pictured herself walking down the aisle at Emma's side, smiling for the photographer, pretending to care about flower arrangements and seating charts. Now, walking through an enemy compound in a dead man's uniform, that future seemed impossibly distant. The relationship between the sisters had always been complicated. Emma was 2 years younger, but she'd always been the normal one, homecoming queen in high school, sorority president in college, engaged to her college sweetheart, with plans for a house in the suburbs and children within 5 years. She represented everything their parents had wanted for both daughters: stability, conventionality, a life that made sense to other people. Sarah had chosen a different path almost from the moment she could make choices. While Emma was playing with dolls, Sarah was building tree forts and exploring the woods behind their house. While Emma was dating the quarterback, Sarah was earning her black belt in karate and training for triathlons. While Emma was pledging a sorority, Sarah was applying to the Naval Academy. Their parents had been supportive, in theory. They'd come to her competitions, celebrated her achievements, even bragged to their friends about their daughter, the Navy SEAL. But Sarah could see the worry in their eyes, the questions they were afraid to ask. Why couldn't she just be happy with a normal life? Why did she always have to push toward the most dangerous, most demanding options available? The truth was, Sarah didn't know how to be happy with normal. She'd tried, briefly, during her sophomore year at the academy when she'd dated a classmate who'd tried to convince her to consider a safer specialty, maybe intelligence or logistics. For about 3 months, she'd let herself imagine a different future, one where she came home to the same person every night, where her biggest worry was whether they had enough milk for breakfast. But that imagined future had felt like suffocation. The restlessness would start as a whisper in the back of her mind, then grow louder until she couldn't ignore it. She needed the challenge, the purpose, the knowledge that what she did mattered on a scale larger than herself. Some people were built for quiet lives. Sarah wasn't one of them. As she approached the first checkpoint, Sarah forced herself to adopt the posture and gait she'd observed from the other guards. Shoulders slightly hunched, steps measured but not too precise. The casual alertness of someone who'd been on watch for several hours. The guards at the checkpoint barely glanced at her as she passed, confirming what she'd hoped: the uniform was enough camouflage in the darkness. The laboratory complex loomed ahead, a 3-story concrete building with minimal windows and heavy security measures. Sarah could see multiple guard positions around the perimeter, including rooftop sentries with night vision equipment. Getting inside would be challenging enough. Getting back out with Dr. Vasquez would require a minor miracle. Sarah thought about the last conversation she'd had with Lieutenant Hayes before the mission began. They'd been going over the operational plan one final time, and Hayes had mentioned that this would likely be his last deployment before rotating back to a stateside training position. "Getting too old for this," he'd said with a wry smile. "My knees remind me every morning that I'm not 25 anymore." Hayes had 3 kids and a wife who'd been extraordinarily patient with his military career. Sarah knew he'd been struggling with the decision to step back from operational duties, torn between his sense of duty to his team and his responsibility to his family. He'd confided in her that his youngest daughter had asked him why he couldn't just have a regular job like her friends' fathers. "What did you tell her?" Sarah had asked. "That Daddy helps keep the world safe so she can have sleepovers and worry about math tests instead of bombs and bad people." Hayes had been a good leader and a better man. He'd given Sarah opportunities that other commanders might not have, recognizing her potential when others saw only her gender. He'd pushed her to be better while never asking her to be anything other than herself. His death felt like a personal betrayal of everything she'd hoped to prove about women in combat roles. The main entrance to the laboratory complex was guarded by 2 sentries who looked significantly more alert than the perimeter guards. Sarah could see additional security measures, card readers, biometric scanners, cameras positioned to cover every angle. This wasn't going to be as simple as walking through the front door. She needed to find another way in, preferably one that didn't involve killing more guards. Each death weighed on her, regardless of the circumstances. The young man whose uniform she now wore had probably joined up for the same reasons most soldiers did, a combination of patriotism, economic necessity, and the desire to be part of something larger than themselves. The fact that he'd chosen the wrong side didn't make his death any easier to carry. Sarah circled the building at a distance, noting the positions of guards and cameras, looking for weaknesses in the security perimeter. On the east side of the building, she found what she was looking for, a service entrance that appeared to be used for deliveries and maintenance. The door was secured with an electronic lock, but there was only one camera covering the area, and its field of view had a blind spot near the loading dock. More importantly, she could see light leaking from under the door, suggesting there was activity inside. If someone was working late in the laboratory, they might provide cover for her entry. She'd learned during her reconnaissance training that the best time to infiltrate a secure facility was often when normal operations were taking place. People expected to see other people moving around, and everyone assumed that someone else had verified that the unknown person belonged there. As she moved toward the service entrance, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Ilana Vasquez, the woman she'd come to rescue. According to her file, Vasquez had earned her Ph.D. in biochemistry from Stanford at age 24, then spent the next 8 years working on cutting-edge research for various government agencies. She'd been considered one of the brightest minds in her field, with a particular expertise in developing countermeasures for biological weapons. The file had included a photograph of a woman in her early 30s with intelligent dark eyes and prematurely gray hair, wearing a lab coat and standing in front of a complex molecular diagram. She looked like someone who lived in her head, who found the natural world endlessly fascinating and couldn't understand why anyone would want to use science to hurt people. According to intelligence reports, Dr. Vasquez had been attending a conference in Pakistan when she'd disappeared. The official story was that she'd been kidnapped by terrorists, but Sarah suspected the truth was more complicated. Brilliant scientists didn't just vanish without leaving traces unless someone with serious resources wanted them to disappear. Question was whether Dr. Vasquez was a willing or unwilling participant in whatever research was taking place in this facility. The intelligence brief suggested she was being held against her will, but Sarah had learned to be skeptical of intelligence briefs, especially after tonight's debacle. As she reached the blind spot near the loading dock, Sarah paused to check her equipment one final time. She had the dead guard's key card, which might or might not work on the service entrance. She had her sidearm with 3 rounds remaining, plus a combat knife and a few other small tools. It wasn't much to work with, but she'd completed missions. With less. The electronic lock beside the service entrance had a card reader and a numeric keypad. Sarah tried the keycard first, holding her breath as the light on the reader flashed red, then yellow, then green. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and she pushed the door open just far enough to peer inside. The service corridor beyond was dimly lit and appeared to be empty. She could hear the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of someone typing on a keyboard. Whatever research was taking place in this facility was happening around the clock, which suggested either extreme urgency or extreme dedication. Sarah slipped inside and let the door close behind her, then took a moment to orient herself. The corridor stretched in both directions, with doors leading off to various laboratories and storage areas. According to the building schematics she'd memorized during mission planning, the primary research labs were located on the second floor, with administrative offices on the third floor and storage and utilities in the basement. If Dr. Vasquez was being held here, she would most likely be in one of the second-floor laboratories, either working under duress or locked in a holding area nearby. Sarah began moving toward the stairwell, every sense alert for signs of danger. As she climbed the stairs to the second floor, Sarah thought about the promise she'd made to Emma about being at her wedding. That promise felt like an anchor to the normal world, a reminder that life existed beyond missions and objectives and the constant calculation of risk versus reward. Emma's wedding represented everything Sarah had given up in pursuit of her career: the certainty of domestic happiness, the comfort of routine, the luxury of caring about things like flowers and table settings. But it also represented something else: the freedom to make those choices because others had chosen differently. Someone had to stand guard while the weddings took place, had to face the dangers that allowed others to worry about mundane concerns. Sarah had never resented Emma for choosing safety and conventionality, but she sometimes wondered if Emma understood the price that others paid for her peaceful life. The second-floor corridor was better lit than the service area, with fluorescent fixtures casting harsh shadows on the polished concrete walls. Sarah could hear more activity now, the sound of equipment running, occasional voices speaking in multiple languages, the electronic beeping of various instruments. This was clearly the operational heart of the facility. She moved carefully from door to door, peering through the small windows in each one. Most of the laboratories appeared to be automated, with equipment running under computer control while technicians monitored from central workstations. The setup was more sophisticated than she'd expected. This wasn't some basement bomb factory, but a legitimate research facility that happened to be working on illegitimate projects. In the third laboratory she checked, Sarah finally found what she was looking for. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat at a computer workstation, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a lab coat over casual clothes. She looked tired but alert, focused intently on whatever data was displayed on her screen. More importantly, she appeared to be alone. Sarah studied the room's layout, noting the positions of cameras and the locations of other exits. There was one camera covering the main work area, positioned to monitor anyone using the primary equipment. But there was a blind spot near the door where she could potentially enter without being detected. The bigger question was Dr. Vasquez herself. Was she working voluntarily, or was she being coerced? If she was a willing participant in whatever research was taking place here, Sarah's rescue mission could quickly turn into a hostage situation. But if she was truly being held against her will, she might be grateful for extraction. There was only one way to find out. Sarah checked the door and found it unlocked apparently. The security measures were designed to keep people out of the building, rather than to keep researchers locked in their labs. She slipped inside and moved quickly to the blind spot she'd identified, then cleared her throat softly to get Dr. Vasquez's attention. The scientist turned around slowly, her eyes widening as she took in Sarah's uniform and obvious military bearing. For a moment, neither woman spoke, each trying to assess the threat level represented by the other. "Dr. Elena Vasquez?" Sarah said quietly, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. Yes, the doctor replied, her voice steady but cautious. And you are? Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reeves, United States Navy. I'm here to get you out. Dr. Vasquez stared at her for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise, hope, and finally skepticism. You're wearing their uniform, she observed. It's a long story. Are you being held here against your will? Dr. Vasquez hesitated, glancing toward the camera, then back at Sarah. It's complicated, most things are. But right now I need a simple answer. Do you want to leave this place or not? Dr. Vasquez stood up from her workstation and walked closer to Sarah. Close enough to speak in a whisper that wouldn't be picked up by surveillance equipment. They killed my research assistant, she said quietly. They told me they'd kill my sister if I didn't cooperate. So yes, I want to leave, but it's not that simple. What I'm working on here, if it falls into the wrong hands, millions of people could die. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What kind of research? Biological weapons. Specifically, weaponized viruses that could be deployed in major population centers. They've been forcing me to develop countermeasures, but the same research could be used to make the weapons more effective. Then we destroy it. It's not just here, Dr. Vasquez said urgently. They have facilities in at least 3 other countries. My research here is just one piece of a larger program. If you destroy this lab, they'll just recreate the work somewhere else, but now they'll know that someone is onto them. Sarah absorbed this information, her mind racing through the implications. The mission she'd thought was a simple extraction had just become significantly more complicated. If Dr. Vasquez was right, they were dealing with something much larger than a single terrorist cell. This was an international program with serious resources and coordination. What do you suggest? Sarah asked. I've been documenting everything, not just my own research, but everything I've been able to access about their other operations. Names, locations, funding sources, operational plans. If we can get that information to the right people, they might be able to shut down the entire network. How much time do you need to gather the information? It's already gathered. I've been preparing for this opportunity for months. But we need to access my personal workstation in my quarters, and that's in a different building. Sarah considered their options. Every minute they spent in the facility increased the risk of discovery. But if Dr. Vasquez was right about the scope of the threat, the intelligence she'd gathered could be far more valuable than her safe extraction. How far is your quarters? About 200 meters. But there are guards, and my building requires special access codes. I'll handle the guards, you handle the access codes. Dr. Vasquez nodded, then moved quickly to her workstation and began shutting down her equipment. I need 5 minutes to make sure there's no trace of what I was working on here. While the doctor worked, Sarah moved to the window and studied the route to the residential building Dr. Vasquez had mentioned. She could see at least 4 guard positions between their current location and their destination, plus the rooftop sentry she'd noted earlier. Getting there undetected would require careful timing and more than a little luck. As she watched the guards' movement patterns, Sarah thought about the conversation she'd had with her parents before this deployment. They'd been supportive as always, but she could hear the worry in their voices, the unspoken questions about when she might consider settling down, finding someone special, maybe thinking about a family of her own. The truth was, Sarah had thought about those things more than she cared to admit. She'd had relationships over the years, mostly with other military personnel who understood the demands and uncertainties of her career. But none of them had lasted. Either the operational tempo had made it impossible to maintain a connection, or the fundamental differences in how they viewed the world had eventually driven them apart. There had been one exception, a Marine Corps captain named David Chun, whom she'd met during a joint training exercise 3 years ago. David had understood her commitment to the service while also challenging her to think about life beyond the teams. They dated for almost a year, and for a while, Sarah had allowed herself to imagine a different future, one that included shared quarters and joint assignments and maybe even children, who would grow up understanding that both their parents had served something larger than themselves. But David had been killed in Syria, and Sarah had learned that love in the military came with a special kind of vulnerability. Losing him had reinforced her belief that emotional attachments were a liability she couldn't afford, that caring too deeply about someone made her less effective at her job. "Ready," Dr. Vasquez announced, joining Sarah at the window. Sarah looked at the scientist, really looked at her for the first time. Dr. Vasquez was younger than her file photo had suggested, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of quiet intensity that came from years of focused intellectual work. But there was something else there too, a core of strength that suggested she'd survived her captivity by finding ways to resist even while appearing to cooperate. "Before we do this," Sarah said, "I need to know, is there anyone else being held here? Other researchers, prisoners, anyone we should be concerned about?" Dr. Vasquez shook her head. "I'm the only Western scientist here. There are local researchers, but they appear to be willing participants. As far as I know, I'm the only prisoner." "Good, that simplifies things." Sarah checked her watch. "We move in 2 minutes. Stay close to me, do exactly what I say, and don't speak unless I ask you a direct question. Understood?" "Understood." As they prepared to leave the laboratory, Sarah found herself thinking about Hayes again, about the promise she'd made to complete this mission. The operation had started as a simple extraction, but it had evolved into something much more significant. If Dr. Vasquez was right about the scope of the biological weapons program, the intelligence they were about to retrieve could prevent a catastrophe that would make their current situation seem trivial by comparison. 6 good soldiers had died tonight, and Sarah was determined to make sure their sacrifice counted for something. She owed them that much, at least. The journey from the laboratory to the residential building should have taken 3 minutes. It took 22 minutes of careful movement, timing their advance with guard rotations and staying in the shadows cast by the facility's security lighting. Dr. Vasquez moved better than Sarah had expected, quietly, responsively, with the kind of situational awareness that suggested she'd been planning her own escape for some time. They made it to within 50 meters of the residential building when everything started to unravel. The first sign of trouble was the sound of vehicles approaching the main gate, multiple engines running in convoy formation. Sarah pulled Dr. Vasquez into the shadow of a maintenance shed and peered around the corner to see 3 black SUVs with government plates pulling into the compound. Even at this distance, she could see they carried military markings from a country that wasn't supposed to be operating in this region. "That's not good," Dr. Vasquez whispered. "You recognize them?" "The lead vehicle belongs to Colonel Dmitry Kozlov. He's supposed to be my handler, but really he's the one running this entire operation. If he's here at this hour, something's gone wrong." Sarah watched as uniformed soldiers emerged from the vehicles, their movements crisp and professional. These weren't local militants or hired mercenaries. These were regular military personnel from a major power, operating in a region where their presence would constitute a serious international incident if discovered. "How often does he visit?" "This is only the 3rd time since I've been here. The last time was 2 months ago, when they brought in new equipment from Russia." Dr. Vasquez paused, studying the soldiers' movements. "He only comes when there's a crisis or when they're planning something big." One of the soldiers broke away from the main group and began jogging toward the laboratory complex they'd just left. Sarah realized with growing alarm that they might have left some trace of their presence, something that had triggered an alert. Or worse, someone might have discovered the guard she'd killed near the perimeter. "We need to move now," Sarah said, urgently. But as they prepared to dash for the residential building, floodlights erupted across the compound, turning night into harsh artificial day. Alarms began wailing, and Sarah could hear shouted orders in Russian echoing off the concrete walls. They'd been discovered. "This way," Dr. Vasquez said, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her toward a different route she apparently knew from months of careful observation. They sprinted across an open area, using a series of concrete barriers as cover. While behind them the compound erupted into organized chaos. Sarah could hear the sound of helicopters in the distance. At least 2 aircraft. Possibly more. Whatever operation was unfolding here tonight was bigger than a simple security breach. This felt like the prelude to something major, and she and Dr. Vasquez were caught in the middle of it. They reached the residential building just as the first helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight sweeping across the compound in systematic patterns. Sarah pressed herself against the building's wall, pulling Dr. Vasquez close beside her as the light passed over their position. "The access code," Sarah whispered urgently. Dr. Vasquez moved to the building's entrance and began entering. Numbers on the keypad beside the door. Her hands were shaking, whether from adrenaline or fear, and she had to start over twice before getting the sequence right. The lock disengaged with a soft electronic chirp, and they slipped inside just as the helicopter completed another pass. Overhead, the residential building was eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Dr. Vasquez led Sarah down a narrow corridor lined with identical doors, each marked with a number and a small nameplate. The accommodations were Spartanly functional, more like a military barracks than civilian housing, which reinforced Sarah's growing suspicion that this facility was run by professional military personnel rather than terrorist cells. "3rd floor," Dr. Vasquez whispered, heading for the stairwell. "My room is 307. As they climbed the stairs, Sarah could hear activity outside intensifying. More vehicles were arriving, and the helicopter had been joined by at least one other aircraft. Whatever had triggered this response, it was being treated as a major security incident. "Tell me about Colonel Kozlov," Sarah said quietly as they reached the 3rd floor. "Former Spetsnaz, according to what I've been able to piece together. He speaks perfect English, has advanced degrees in both chemistry and engineering, and seems to have unlimited resources at his disposal. He's not some rogue operative, he's representing state interests." Dr. Vasquez stopped at room 307 and produced a key from her pocket. The room beyond was small but efficiently organized, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a computer workstation that looked far more sophisticated than standard dormitory equipment. "The data is here," Dr. Vasquez said, moving to her computer and beginning to power it up. "But I need 5 minutes to transfer everything to a portable drive." Sarah positioned herself by the window, watching the activity in the compound below. The soldiers were conducting a systematic search of every building, working in pairs with professional efficiency. "They'd reach this building within minutes. We don't have 5 minutes. Then we don't get the intelligence. This computer is biometrically locked and equipped with a data destruction system. If I try to rush the transfer, or if someone else tries to access it, everything gets wiped automatically." Sarah weighed their options. The intelligence Dr. Vasquez had gathered could be crucial for preventing a larger catastrophe, but staying here much longer would likely get them both killed. Sometimes the mission required accepting calculated risks. "Do it," she decided, "but be ready to run the moment you're finished." As Dr. Vasquez worked at her computer, Sarah continued monitoring the search outside. The soldiers were being thorough, but not frantic. They were looking for something specific, not conducting a panicked sweep for intruders. That suggested they knew exactly what they were dealing with. "Sarah," Dr. Vasquez said quietly, not looking up from her screen, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "How many people died getting you in here?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, Rodriguez, 6 good soldiers who trusted their leaders and followed their orders into what turned out to be a trap. 6, she said simply. Dr. Vasquez stopped typing for a moment, her shoulders sagging. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't help, but I'm sorry. They died because of me, because of the work I was forced to do here. They died because someone betrayed them, Sarah corrected. This mission was compromised before we ever set foot in this country. Someone with access to classified operational information sold us out. Do you know who? Not yet, but I will. The computer chimed softly, indicating the data transfer was complete. Dr. Vasquez removed a small portable drive and handed it to Sarah. Everything's there, she said. Research data, financial records, personnel files, communication logs, facility locations, everything I could access over the past 6 months. Sarah pocketed the drive, then checked her watch. They'd been in the building for 8 minutes longer than she'd wanted, but hopefully not long enough for the search teams to reach them. Now we go, she said, but as they moved toward the door, they heard the distinctive sound of boots on stairs, multiple sets, moving with military precision. The search had reached their building. Sarah looked around the room quickly, assessing their options. There was one window, but it faced the central courtyard where most of the activity was concentrated. The door was the only exit, and soldiers were already in the stairwell. Is there another way out of this building? She whispered. Dr. Vasquez shook her head. I've been here 6 months. If there was another way out, I would have found it. The footsteps were getting closer. Second floor now, maybe 30 seconds away. Sarah made a decision that went against every tactical principle she'd ever learned. Instead of hiding or running, she was going to attack. Stay here, she told Dr. Vasquez. No matter what happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Sarah positioned herself beside the door, drawing her sidearm and checking the 3 remaining rounds. 3 bullets, and she could hear at least 4 sets of footsteps in the stairwell. The math wasn't encouraging, but she'd worked with worse odds before. The first soldier appeared in the corridor outside, his rifle held at low ready as he moved methodically from door to door. Sarah could see through the crack under her door that he was wearing night vision goggles, standard equipment for professional military units operating in low-light conditions. She waited until he was directly outside her door, then yanked it open and put her first round center mass before he could react. The soldier went down hard, his rifle clattering against the wall as he fell. The sound brought his partner running from the far end of the corridor. Sarah's second shot caught him in the chest as he rounded the corner, but his body armor absorbed most of the impact. He staggered but remained upright, bringing his own weapon to bear. Sarah's third and final round took him in the head, and he dropped immediately, 2 down, but she could hear more soldiers responding to the gunfire. They'd be more cautious now, probably calling for backup and setting up a perimeter around the building. The easy part was over. Sarah quickly stripped weapons and ammunition from the 2 dead soldiers, then retreated into the room where Dr. Vasquez was waiting with wide, frightened eyes. Are you hurt? The scientist asked. No, but we're not getting out of here the conventional way. Sarah moved to the window and studied the drop to the courtyard below. 3 stories, onto concrete. Survivable. But barely. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez said quietly. Something I didn't tell you before. Sarah turned to look at her, noting the guilty expression on the scientist's face. What? I'm not the only one here. There's another American, a CIA operative, who was captured about 3 weeks ago. They've been holding him in the basement of the main building, trying to get information about U.S. intelligence operations in the region. Sarah felt her heart sink. Another American prisoner met another complication, another person she was responsible for extracting. But it also explained some of what was happening tonight. If the CIA operative had somehow managed to signal for help, that might have triggered the enhanced security response. Why didn't you mention this before? Because I wasn't sure he was still alive. And because I knew that if I told you about him, you'd try to rescue him too, and that would make our escape much more difficult. Dr. Vasquez was right, of course. Sarah couldn't leave a fellow American behind, especially not a CIA operative who might have intelligence that could prevent future operations from being compromised. But rescuing him would require going back into the most heavily guarded part of the compound through search teams that were now actively hunting for them. What's his name? Michael Torres. He's been here since early December. They bring him up sometimes for interrogation sessions in the main laboratory building. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to think through their options. The smart play was to focus on getting Dr. Vasquez and her intelligence out of the compound. One rescued scientist with crucial information was better than 3 dead Americans with nothing to show for their sacrifice. But the SEAL creed was clear: never leave a fallen comrade. Torres might not be a SEAL, but he was an American serviceman in enemy hands, and that made him her responsibility. Where exactly in the basement? Sub-level 2, cell block C. But Sarah, the security down there is... I don't care about the security. Sarah checked her newly acquired weapons, 2 assault rifles with full magazines, plus the sidearm she'd taken from the dead soldiers. I'm not leaving him behind. Dr. Vasquez stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we'll need a distraction. Something big enough to draw most of the guards away from the main building. What do you have in mind? Dr. Vasquez smiled grimly. I've been working with some very dangerous materials for the past 6 months. Materials that become extremely unstable when mixed with common household chemicals. Creating this type of content requires significant time and effort to research and write. If you're finding this story engaging, please take a moment to like and share it with others who might enjoy it. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You're talking about creating an explosion. I'm talking about creating the kind of explosion that will make them think they're under attack by a full military unit. The laboratory building has enough volatile compounds to level half the compound if they're combined properly. And how do we trigger this explosion without killing ourselves in the process? Very carefully, Dr. Vasquez said. And with a lot of luck. As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, they heard the sound of more vehicles arriving outside, followed by shouted orders in Russian and Arabic. The compound was being reinforced, probably with additional troops and equipment. Whatever window of opportunity they'd had was closing rapidly. Sarah made her decision. Show me what you need. For the next 20 minutes, they moved through the compound like ghosts, haunting their own haunted house. Dr. Vasquez led Sarah through a series of maintenance tunnels and service corridors she'd mapped during her months in captivity, routes that the search teams hadn't thought to cover. The scientist moved with surprising confidence in the darkness, navigating by memory and instinct through spaces most people would find claustrophobic. I spent a lot of nights exploring, Dr. Vasquez explained quietly as they crawled through a ventilation shaft that connected the residential building to the main laboratory complex. When you're a prisoner, knowledge of your environment becomes a form of resistance. They emerged into a storage room filled with cleaning supplies and maintenance equipment. Dr. Vasquez immediately began gathering specific chemicals, reading labels carefully in the dim light cast by Sarah's tactical flashlight. Industrial ammonia, concentrated bleach, several organic solvents, she murmured, stuffing bottles into a canvas bag. Combined with the right compounds from my laboratory, these will create a chain reaction that should be visible from orbit. Sarah kept watch at the door while Dr. Vasquez worked, listening for signs that the search teams had expanded their operation to include the maintenance areas. So far, they seemed to be focused on the obvious hiding places: offices, laboratories, residential rooms. They hadn't yet realized that their quarry might be moving through the building's infrastructure. How long do we have once you start the chemical reaction? Sarah asked. Depends on exactly which compounds I can access in the lab. Anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 seconds. That's a pretty wide range. Chemistry isn't always predictable, especially when you're working with stolen materials in less than ideal conditions. They moved from the storage room into the laboratory complex, retracing the route Sarah had taken earlier that evening. But the building felt different, now more threatening, with the constant background noise of search teams moving through other areas and the periodic crackle of radio communications. Dr. Vasquez led her to a different laboratory than the one where they'd first met, this one filled with equipment that looked more industrial than research-oriented. Large steel tanks connected to complex piping systems, computer-controlled mixing chambers, and containment systems that suggested the materials being processed here were both valuable and dangerous. This is where they've been having me work on weaponization protocols, Dr. Vasquez said, moving quickly to a locked cabinet and producing a key from her pocket. The compounds in here are designed to be stable until triggered, then to release their energy very quickly. Sarah watched the scientist work, noting the practiced efficiency with which she selected and combined different chemicals. Dr. Vasquez might have been forced to work on biological weapons, but she clearly understood the broader principles of creating controlled explosions. How did you get a key to that cabinet? I've been planning this for months, Dr. Vasquez replied, carefully measuring a colorless liquid into a small beaker. I made an impression of the key during my second week here, then had one of the local workers create a duplicate in exchange for medical advice for his daughter. The improvised explosive device that Dr. Vasquez assembled looked like nothing more than a collection of laboratory glassware connected by rubber tubing. But Sarah could see the careful precision with which each component had been positioned, the deliberate way the scientist had created multiple points of failure that would cascade into a single massive release of energy. The timer is the tricky part, Dr. Vasquez said, working with a small electronic device that appeared to have been cannibalized from other equipment. I can give us anywhere from 2 minutes to 15 minutes, but I can't guarantee the accuracy. Give us 8 minutes, Sarah decided. That should be enough time to reach the basement and locate Torres, but not so much time that the guards have a chance to figure out what's happening. Dr. Vasquez made a final adjustment to her improvised timer, then stepped back from the device. Once I activate this, we can't come back. The explosion will destroy this entire building and probably damage several others. Any other Americans in the complex? Not that I've seen. Just Torres in the basement. Sarah nodded. Do it. Dr. Vasquez pressed a button on the timer, and a small LED began blinking red. 8 minutes, she confirmed. They left the laboratory and began moving toward the main building, using the same maintenance tunnels and service corridors that had brought them this far. But now they were racing against time as well as the search teams, with a lethal deadline that couldn't be negotiated or extended. The basement of the main building was accessed through a heavily secured stairwell that required both keycard access and biometric identification. Fortunately, Dr. Vasquez had been brought to this area several times for meetings with Colonel Kozlov, and she'd managed to memorize the security protocols. There are usually 2 guards at the main checkpoint, she warned as they approached the stairwell. But with all the activity tonight, they might have pulled some personnel for the search operation. They were partially right. There was only 1 guard at the checkpoint, but he was wide awake and alert, probably expecting trouble after the earlier gunfire in the residential building. Sarah studied his position carefully, noting that he had good cover behind a reinforced desk and a clear field of fire down the corridor they needed to use. Can you get his attention? Sarah asked Dr. Vasquez. Make him think you're trying to surrender or ask for help. I can try. But if he recognizes me, he'll know something's wrong. I'm supposed to be in my quarters at this hour. We'll deal with that when it happens. Dr. Vasquez nodded and walked boldly down the corridor toward the guard station, her hands raised and her voice calling out in a mixture of English and Arabic. The guard immediately focused on her, shouting commands and reaching for his radio to report the contact. Sarah used the distraction to close the distance from the opposite direction, moving along the wall until she was within striking range. The guard never saw her coming. Her combat knife found the gap between his ribs before he could complete his radio call, and he slumped forward over his desk without making another sound. 5 minutes, Dr. Vasquez reminded her as they used the dead guard's access cards to enter the secure stairwell. The basement was a maze of corridors and holding cells that felt more like a military prison than part of a research facility. The air was stale and humid, carrying the unmistakable smell of fear and desperation that came from places where people were held against their will. They found cell block C without difficulty, but locating Torres within the block required checking each cell individually. Most were empty, but a few contained prisoners who appeared to be local civilians, probably people who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time when security sweeps were conducted. Torres was in the last cell they checked, and Sarah's first sight of him sent a chill through her stomach. The CIA operative had clearly been subjected to professional interrogation techniques. His face was bruised and swollen. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, suggesting a dislocated shoulder, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone dealing with multiple injuries. But his eyes were alert when he saw them approaching his cell, and he managed a weak smile of recognition when he realized they were Americans. Sarah Reeves, she identified herself quietly. Navy SEALs. We're here to get you out. Mike Torres, CIA, he replied, his voice hoarse but steady. I was wondering when someone would show up. Dr. Vasquez was already working on the electronic lock securing Torres's cell, using techniques she'd apparently learned during her months of captivity. The lock disengaged with a soft click, and Torres limped out into the corridor. Can you move? Sarah asked, assessing his injuries. I can move, Torres confirmed. Might not be pretty, but I can move. 2 minutes, Dr. Vasquez announced, checking her watch. They began retracing their route toward the surface, but Torres's injuries slowed their progress significantly. He was trying his best, but his left leg was clearly bothering him, and his dislocated shoulder made it difficult for him to maintain balance on the uneven stairs. Leave me, he said as they reached the ground floor. I'm slowing you down, and that explosion is going to bring every guard in the compound running toward this building. No one gets left behind, Sarah said firmly, taking his good arm to help support his weight. Dr. Vasquez, how much time? Maybe 90 seconds. They emerged from the stairwell into the main corridor of the building just as the first explosion shook the structure around them. The improvised device had detonated ahead of schedule, and Sarah could hear secondary explosions as other materials in the laboratory building began to chain react. Alarms throughout the compound began wailing, and Sarah could hear shouted commands as guards and soldiers rushed toward the source of the explosions. The distraction was working, but they were running out of time to capitalize on it. This way, Dr. Vasquez called, leading them toward a service exit she'd identified during their planning. There's a loading dock that should get us to the perimeter fence. But as they approached the exit, they found their path blocked by 3 soldiers who'd been stationed there as a security measure. The soldiers saw them coming and immediately began shouting warnings and raising their weapons. Sarah pushed Torres and Dr. Vasquez behind a concrete pillar and opened fire with her captured assault rifle. The engagement was brief but vicious. The soldiers had cover and superior numbers, but Sarah had the advantage of surprise and professional training. When the shooting stopped, all 3 soldiers were down, but Sarah had expended most of her remaining ammunition. Go, she told the others, checking Torres's injuries to make sure he hadn't been hit by stray bullets. The fence is 50 meters. Straight ahead. There's a gap near the northeast corner that should be big enough to get through. As they reached the loading dock, another massive explosion shook the compound, this one large enough to shatter windows in the surrounding buildings. Dr. Vasquez's improvised bomb had apparently found something even more volatile than she'd expected, creating a chain reaction that was turning the laboratory complex into an inferno. The perimeter fence was exactly where Dr. Vasquez had said it would be, and the gap she'd mentioned was barely large enough for them to squeeze through. But it was enough. As they crawled through the opening, Sarah could hear helicopters approaching, not the same aircraft that had been searching the compound earlier, but larger, heavier birds that sounded like rescue or extraction assets. "That's our ride," Torres said, recognizing the distinctive sound of American military helicopters. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a sterile briefing room at Bagram Air Base, her left shoulder immobilized in a medical sling, watching as intelligence analysts presented their preliminary findings from Dr. Vasquez's data cache. The portable drive contained over 2 terabytes of information spanning 6 months of covert operations, and each new revelation made the scope of the conspiracy more frightening. "The biological weapons program is more advanced than we initially assessed," Colonel Martinez explained, clicking through slides that showed facility locations across 4 different countries. Dr. Vasquez's research wasn't just about countermeasures. They were using her work to perfect delivery systems that could deploy biological agents in major population centers. Sarah studied the faces around the briefing table. In addition to Colonel Martinez, there were representatives from the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and several other agencies whose acronyms she wasn't supposed to know. Torres sat across from her, his arm still in a sling, but looking considerably better after 3 days of medical treatment and debriefing sessions. "What about the security breach?" Sarah asked. "Someone fed our operational plan to the enemy. Have we identified the source?" Colonel Martinez exchanged glances with the CIA representative, a stern-faced woman named Director Phillips who'd flown in specifically for this briefing. "That's complicated," Director Phillips said carefully. "The investigation is ongoing, but we've identified several potential sources of the leak." "Potential sources?" The operational plan was distributed to 14 different individuals across multiple agencies, Director Phillips continued. "Any one of them could have been the source, either deliberately or through compromised communications." Sarah felt her frustration mounting. 6 good soldiers had died because someone had betrayed their mission, and the investigation was still focused on potential sources rather than actual accountability. "With respect, ma'am, that sounds like bureaucratic bullshit," she said bluntly. "Someone specific sold us out. Someone with a name and a security clearance and access to classified information. I want to know who." The silence in the room was uncomfortable, the kind of tension that came when military personnel and intelligence officials had fundamentally different approaches to problem solving. "Lieutenant Commander," Colonel Martinez said carefully, "I understand your frustration, but counterintelligence investigations take time. We have to be absolutely certain before we make accusations." "My teammates didn't have time," Sarah replied. "Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, Rodriguez, they're dead because someone couldn't be trusted with classified information. While we're conducting careful investigations, how many other operations are being compromised?" Dr. Vasquez, who'd been quiet throughout most of the briefing, suddenly spoke up from her position at the far end of the table. "There might be another way to identify the source," she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Director Phillips asked. "The intelligence I gathered includes communication logs from the facility's command structure. When they received information about your operation, it came through specific channels at specific times. If we can match those timestamps with the distribution of the operational plan, Torres leaned forward with interest. "You're talking about correlation analysis. Find out exactly when the enemy received their intelligence, then work backward to see who had access to our plans at that time." "Exactly," Dr. Vasquez confirmed. The data was all their communication records, timestamps, even some audio recordings of planning sessions conducted by Colonel Kozlov and his staff. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Finally, they might have a way to identify the traitor who'd gotten her teammates killed. How long would that analysis take? She asked. With the right resources, maybe 6 hours, Dr. Vasquez replied. But it would require access to the classified distribution records for your mission planning. Director Phillips looked uncomfortable. Those records are highly classified. Sharing them with civilian researchers would require— Dr. Vasquez isn't a civilian researcher, Sarah interrupted. She's a government scientist who was held prisoner for 6 months and who risked her life to gather intelligence that could prevent a biological weapons attack on American cities. If she can't be trusted with classification levels, then our entire security system is worthless. The argument that followed was heated but brief. In the end, practical necessity won out over bureaucratic caution. Dr. Vasquez was given temporary security clearances and access to the mission planning records, while Sarah and Torres were assigned to assist with the correlation analysis. Working in a secure computer facility at Bagram, they began the painstaking process of matching timestamps and communication patterns. Dr. Vasquez had been thorough in her documentation, every conversation she'd witnessed, every communication she'd been able to intercept, every detail she'd observed about the facility's operations. Here, Torres said, pointing to a specific entry in the communication logs. December 15th, 0347 hours local time. Kozlov received a detailed briefing about SEAL team protocols and standard operating procedures. Sarah checked the mission planning timeline. That's 18 hours before our operational plan was finalized. Whoever provided that information had access to preliminary planning documents. They worked through the night, building a timeline that showed exactly when specific pieces of intelligence had reached the enemy. The pattern that emerged was both clear and damning. Someone with high-level access had been feeding information to hostile forces for at least 3 months, possibly longer. It's not random, Dr. Vasquez observed as they assembled their findings. The intelligence was provided systematically, always with enough lead time for the enemy to prepare countermeasures. This wasn't someone selling classified information. For money, this was someone actively working to compromise American operations. By dawn, they had their answer. The correlation analysis pointed to a single individual who'd had access to all the compromised information at the relevant times. Sarah stared at the name on their final report, feeling a mixture of vindication and disgust. Deputy Director Harold Morrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. A 23-year veteran of the intelligence community with top-secret clearances and access to operational planning for Special Operations Forces. Someone who should have been above suspicion. Son of a bitch, Torres muttered, reading over Sarah's shoulder. Morrison's been briefing the National Security Council for the past 2 years. He's had access to everything: operational plans, personnel assignments, intelligence assessments. Sarah thought about Morrison, trying to remember their few interactions. He'd struck her as competent, but unremarkable. The kind of career bureaucrat who'd survived multiple administrations by avoiding controversy and following established procedures. The last person anyone would suspect of treason. What's his motivation? She asked. Dr. Vasquez pulled up additional files from her data cache. According to the financial records I accessed, someone matching Morrison's profile has been receiving payments through a series of shell companies connected to Russian intelligence services. About $2 million over the past 18 months. He sold out American soldiers for money, Sarah said, feeling her anger building to dangerous levels. We need to present this to the investigation team, Torres said, gathering their files. They'll want to verify our analysis before taking action. The presentation to the intelligence officials went better than Sarah had expected. Director Phillips and her colleagues examined the correlation analysis with professional skepticism, but the evidence was overwhelming. Morrison had betrayed multiple operations, leading to the deaths of dozens of American personnel and the compromise of sensitive intelligence sources. "We'll need to coordinate his arrest carefully," Director Phillips explained. "Morrison still has access to classified information, and we can't risk him destroying evidence or alerting his handlers." "How long will that take?" Sarah asked. "Probably 48 to 72 hours. We need to prepare search warrants, coordinate with other agencies, and ensure we can gather all the evidence simultaneously." Sarah felt her frustration returning. More delays, more bureaucratic processes, while Morrison continued to have access to classified information that could compromise other operations. "What about the biological weapons program?" she asked. "Are we taking action against the other facilities Dr. Vasquez identified?" "That's being handled at a different level," Colonel Martinez replied diplomatically. "Your mission was to extract Dr. Vasquez and gather intelligence. Both objectives have been accomplished." But Sarah could see in the officials' faces that the larger operation was still being planned, probably involving multiple agencies and international coordination. The kind of complex diplomatic and military action that took months to organize properly. "How many people are going to die while we're organizing?" she asked bluntly. "Lieutenant Commander," Director Phillips said firmly, "I understand your frustration. But these are complex issues that require careful coordination. We can't just launch military strikes against facilities in sovereign nations without proper authorization and planning." Sarah nodded, recognizing the political realities even as she chafed against them. But she also recognized something else: the intelligence community's tendency to overcomplicate situations that might be better handled with direct action. After the briefing concluded, Sarah found herself walking through the base with Dr. Vasquez, both of them processing the implications of what they'd learned. "Do you think they'll actually shut down the biological weapons program?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "Eventually," Sarah replied. "But it'll take time, and time means more people at risk." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, two women who'd shared an experience that most people would never understand. Dr. Vasquez had survived 6 months in captivity, while secretly gathering intelligence that could save thousands of lives. Sarah had lost her entire team, but completed a mission that had revealed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of the American intelligence community. "What happens to you now?" Sarah asked. "Debriefings, psychological evaluations, probably. Months of testimony for various congressional committees," Dr. Vasquez replied with a tired smile. "And eventually, back to my laboratory, trying to develop countermeasures for biological weapons instead of being forced to improve them." "And what happens to us? I mean, this experience, what we went through together." Dr. Vasquez considered the question carefully. "I think what happens is that we both continue serving in our own ways, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that never make it into official reports." Sarah understood what she meant. The correlation analysis that had identified Morrison as a traitor would probably be classified at the highest levels, never to be publicly acknowledged. The biological weapons program would be disrupted through diplomatic and covert channels, with the public never knowing how close they'd come to a catastrophic attack. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" Sarah asked. "All the secrecy, the classification, the fact that most people will never know what really happened here." "Every day," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "But then I think about the alternative. If we hadn't stopped this program, if Morrison had continued compromising operations, if you hadn't come for me when you did, the world would be a more dangerous place." That afternoon, Sarah received word that Deputy Director Morrison had been arrested at his home in Virginia, along with several associates who'd been identified through the financial records Dr. Vasquez had gathered. The arrest had been conducted quietly, without media attention, as part of what officials described as an ongoing counterintelligence investigation. She also received notification that she'd been awarded the Navy Cross for her actions during the mission, along with posthumous decorations for her fallen teammates. The citations were heavily redacted, referring vaguely to extraordinary heroism in connection with operations against hostile forces, without mentioning any specific details. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez would be buried with full military honors, their families told that they died serving their country in classified operations. The families would never know exactly how their loved ones had died or why, but they'd know that their sacrifice had mattered. Torres found her that evening as she was preparing to board a transport flight back to the United States. "Heard you're getting the Navy Cross," he said. "So are you. And Dr. Vasquez is getting the civilian equivalent. Think it's enough?" Sarah considered the question. 6 men had died, a traitor had been exposed, and a biological weapons program had been disrupted. The medals were recognition of service, but they couldn't restore the lives that had been lost, or undo the betrayal that had made their deaths necessary. "It's what we have," she said finally. "It's not enough, but it's what we have." 6 months after the mission, Sarah stood at Arlington National Cemetery, watching as her sister Emma placed flowers on Hayes's grave. It was Memorial Day, and the cemetery was filled with families honoring their fallen loved ones. But Sarah had asked Emma to come with her for a private moment before the crowds arrived. "Tell me about him," Emma said quietly, reading the inscription on the headstone. "Lieutenant Michael Hayes, Navy SEAL, beloved husband and father." Sarah thought about how to explain Hayes to someone who'd never served, never understood the bonds that formed between people who trusted each other with their lives. "He was the best leader I ever served under," she said finally. "Not because he was the smartest or the toughest, but because he understood that leadership meant taking care of your people. He made me a better soldier and a better person." Emma nodded, though Sarah could see in her expression the struggle to understand what her sister had experienced. The classified nature of the mission meant that Sarah couldn't share most of the details, couldn't explain exactly how Hayes had died or why his sacrifice had mattered. But she could share the human elements, the loss, the grief, the ongoing sense of responsibility to honor his memory. "Have you talked to his family?" Emma asked a few times. "His wife knows I was there when it happened, though she doesn't know the details. She asked me to be one of the speakers at his memorial service." The memorial service had been one of the hardest things Sarah had ever done, standing before Hayes's wife and 3 children and trying to explain why their husband and father had died without being able to tell them the truth about the mission. She'd talked about his leadership, his dedication to his team, his love for his family, all true things that skirted around the classified details of how he'd been betrayed and killed. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, studying her sister's face with the kind of concern that only family could provide. Sarah considered the question honestly. She'd been through extensive debriefings and psychological evaluations since returning from Afghanistan. Officially, she was fit for duty and ready for reassignment. Unofficially, she was still processing the trauma of losing her entire team and the knowledge that their deaths had been preventable. "I'm getting there," she said. "Some days are better than others." The truth was more complicated. Sarah had been having nightmares about the mission, vivid dreams where she relived the ambush and the death of her teammates. She'd been seeing a military psychologist who specialized in combat trauma, learning techniques for managing survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress. But she'd also been working on something constructive, a comprehensive review of operational security procedures that could prevent future betrayals like Morrison's. The Navy had asked her to lead a special committee examining how classified information was distributed and protected during special operations planning. "I have something to tell you," Emma said, taking her sister's hand. "Jim and I are naming Our first child after one of your teammates, if that's okay with you." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Emma and Jim had gotten married 2 months after Sarah's return from Afghanistan, a ceremony that Sarah had attended despite still recovering from her injuries. It had been strange, standing in a church wearing a pink bridesmaid dress, trying to focus on wedding vows while her mind kept drifting back to a concrete courtyard littered with the bodies of her teammates. "Which name?" Sarah asked, though she was already hoping she knew the answer. "Michael, after Lieutenant Hayes. I know I never met him, but from everything you've told me, he sounds like the kind of person I'd want my son to be named after." Sarah hugged her sister tightly, feeling a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. Hayes would never know that his name would live on in a child, who might grow up to be a teacher or an engineer or anything other than a soldier. But somehow that felt appropriate, the next generation living normal, peaceful lives because people like Hayes had been willing to sacrifice everything to protect them. He would have been honored, Sarah said. They spent another hour at the cemetery, visiting the graves of Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez. Sarah had made a point of staying in touch with all their families, attending funerals and memorial services, making sure that their sacrifice was remembered by someone who'd been there when it happened. The families had welcomed her with a mixture of gratitude and grief, recognizing her as their connection to their loved ones' final moments. She'd become an unofficial keeper of their stories, someone who could tell their children what their fathers had been like as soldiers and teammates. Dr. Vasquez had helped with that burden, attending several of the funerals and sharing her own perspective on how the team's sacrifice had prevented a larger catastrophe. The biochemist had recovered well from her ordeal, returning to her research with a new focus on developing protective measures against biological weapons. The foundation they'd established would ensure their teammates' sacrifice continued serving others. It wasn't enough to bring back the dead, but it was a way of ensuring that their sacrifice continued to serve a purpose. "I need to tell you something else," Sarah said as they walked back toward the cemetery entrance. "I'm being reassigned." Emma stopped walking. "Where?" "Quantico. I'm going to be teaching at the Special Warfare Development Group, helping to train the next generation of SEALs." Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's still classified work, but it's stateside, and it's focused on education rather than direct action. That sounds safer. It is safer. But it's also important. After what happened with Morrison and the security breach, the military is restructuring how we train people to handle classified information and operational security." The new assignment was both a promotion and a recognition of Sarah's unique qualifications. Her experience with the betrayal and its consequences had given her insights into vulnerabilities that most instructors couldn't provide. She'd be responsible for developing new protocols that could prevent future teams from walking into ambushes like the one that had killed her teammates. But the assignment also represented a transition in her career, a move away from direct operational duties toward a role that was more sustainable in the long term. At 32, Sarah was getting older for the kind of missions she'd been conducting, and the physical and psychological toll of losing her entire team had made it clear that she needed to find new ways to serve. "Are you happy about it?" Emma asked. "I think so. It's different from what I imagined when I joined the SEALs, but it feels like the right next step. I'll still be serving, still be making a difference, but in a way that might actually let me have a life outside the military." That afternoon, Sarah drove to Bethesda Naval Hospital to visit Mike Torres, who was undergoing physical therapy for the injuries he'd sustained during his captivity. The CIA operative had recovered well, but his left shoulder would never fully regain its original range of motion, and he walked with a slight limp that would probably be permanent. "Heard about your new assignment," he said as they sat in the hospital's rehabilitation center, watching other wounded warriors work to regain their strength and mobility. "Good news travels fast. It's a good fit." You've got the operational experience and the analytical skills to make a real difference in how we train people. Torres had been assigned to a similar role at CIA headquarters, developing new counterintelligence protocols based on their experience with Morrison's betrayal. The investigation into the deputy director's activities had revealed a network of compromised operations that had cost dozens of lives over several years. Any word on Morrison's trial? Sarah asked. Plea agreement. Life in prison without parole, in exchange for full cooperation with the damage assessment. Turns out he compromised more operations than we initially realized. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anger at Morrison's name. The traitor was spending the rest of his life in a federal prison, but that seemed like insufficient punishment for the deaths he'd caused. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez would never see their families again because Morrison had decided that money was more important than loyalty to his country. At least he can't hurt anyone else, she said. No, but the damage is still being calculated. Some of the operations he compromised are just now coming to light. We're talking about years of rebuilding intelligence networks and operational capabilities. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who'd shared an experience that most of their colleagues would never understand. The mission to extract Dr. Vasquez had been classified at the highest levels, with most of the details likely to remain secret for decades. Do you ever regret it? Torres asked. Going back for me, I mean. You and Dr. Vasquez could have escaped without the additional risk. Sarah considered the question. Ask me again in 20 years. Right now, I'm just glad we all made it out. The truth was more complicated. The decision to rescue Torres had nearly gotten all three of them killed, and there were moments during the escape when Sarah had wondered if she'd made the wrong choice. But she also knew that she couldn't have lived with herself if she'd left an American prisoner behind, regardless of the tactical considerations. That evening, Sarah had dinner with Dr. Vasquez at a restaurant near the Pentagon. The biochemist had been spending increasing amounts of time in Washington, consulting with various agencies about biological weapons threats and defensive measures. How's the foundation coming along? Dr. Vasquez asked, referring to the memorial organization they'd established for Sarah's fallen teammates. Better than expected. We've got enough funding to provide scholarships for 10 military families this year, and the research grants are starting to produce some interesting results. The foundation had become a way for both women to channel their survivors' guilt into something constructive. Rather than simply mourning the dead, they were working to ensure that future military families would have better support and that future operations would be better protected against the kind of betrayal that had killed Sarah's team. I have some news, Dr. Vasquez said. The biological weapons program we disrupted has been completely shut down. All 4 facilities have been closed, and most of the personnel involved have been arrested or relocated. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. The intelligence Dr. Vasquez had gathered during her captivity had ultimately led to a coordinated international operation that had dismantled one of the most sophisticated biological weapons programs ever discovered. How many lives do you think we saved? Sarah asked. Impossible to calculate. But the delivery systems they were developing could have killed hundreds of thousands of people in a single attack. Probably more. It was a sobering reminder of what had been at stake during their mission. The death of 6 good soldiers was a tragedy, but it had prevented a catastrophe that could have killed orders of magnitude more people. Sometimes I wonder if Hayes and the others would think it was worth it, Sarah said. I think they would, Dr. Vasquez replied. From what you've told me about them, they were the kind of people who understood that some things are worth dying for. As they finished dinner, Sarah found herself thinking about the future for the first time in months. The new assignment at Quantico would give her a chance to influence how the next generation of special operations personnel was trained, potentially preventing future betrayals and ambushes. More importantly, the stateside position would give her an opportunity to maintain relationships outside the military with Emma and her growing family, with the families of her fallen teammates, with people like Dr. Vasquez who understood the importance of the work without being consumed by it. "Are you going to stay in the Navy?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "For now, maybe forever, maybe not. But I'm learning that service doesn't always have to mean putting yourself in the most dangerous situations possible." Walking back to her hotel that night, Sarah found herself thinking about Lieutenant Hayes and the conversation they'd had before the mission about his decision to step back from operational duties. At the time, she'd seen his choice as a kind of surrender, acceptance of limitations rather than a commitment to service. Now, she understood that he'd been trying to find a way to serve that was sustainable, that would allow him to contribute, without sacrificing everything else that mattered in his life. His death had prevented him from achieving that balance, but his example had shown Sarah that it was possible to remain committed to the mission while also remaining human. The next morning, Sarah received a phone call from Emma. "I wanted you to be the first to know," her sister said, excitement clear in her voice. "We just found out we're having a boy." Sarah smiled, thinking about her future nephew who would grow up in a world made safer by the sacrifice of men he'd never meet, but whose name he would carry. "Michael is going to be lucky to have you as parents," she said, "and he's going to be lucky to have you as an aunt. Someone who can teach him about courage and service and doing the right thing even when it's difficult." After the call ended, Sarah began packing for her move to Quantico, carefully folding the uniform she'd worn through 7 years of SEAL operations. Some of them would go into storage, mementos of a chapter of her life that was ending. Others would come with her to her new assignment, reminders of the experiences that had shaped her into the person she'd become. At the bottom of her sea bag, she found a small American flag that Hayes had carried during their final mission together. She'd recovered it from his body in that concrete courtyard in Afghanistan, and she'd been carrying it with her ever since. Tomorrow she would begin training the next generation of warriors, passing on the lessons she'd learned and the wisdom that had cost her teammates their lives. The flag would have a place of honor in her new office, a reminder that every lesson had been paid for with blood and every protocol existed to prevent future tragedies. But tonight, she simply held the flag and remembered 6 good soldiers who'd died believing in something larger than themselves. Their sacrifice had meaning because people like Sarah continued to serve, continued to fight for the ideals they believed in, continued to train others who would carry on their mission. War would continue in various forms and in various places, but it would be fought by people who were better trained, better protected, and better prepared because of the lessons learned from one mission that had gone terribly wrong and somehow ended up saving countless lives. The lecture hall at Quantico was filled with the next generation of Navy SEALs, young men and women whose faces reminded Sarah of herself 15 years earlier, eager, confident, absolutely certain that they were invincible. She looked out at them from behind the podium, noting the way they sat forward in their chairs, hanging on every word of her presentation about operational security and intelligence protection. "The enemy you face isn't always wearing a uniform or carrying a rifle," she told them, advancing to a slide that showed Deputy Director Morrison's photograph. "Sometimes the greatest threat to your mission comes from someone who's supposed to be on your side." One of the students, a young lieutenant named Jackson, who reminded her painfully of Martinez, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we protect against threats we can't identify?" It was the right question, the one that showed he was thinking beyond the obvious dangers of combat operations to the more insidious risks that could compromise entire teams. "You build redundancy into your operational planning," Sarah replied. "You compartmentalize information so that no single person has access to everything. And you trust your instincts when something feels wrong." After the lecture, Sarah walked across the base to her office, where she found Dr. Elena Vasquez waiting. with a stack of research proposals from the foundation they'd established in memory of the fallen SEAL team. "The scholarship applications are in," Dr. Vasquez announced, spreading the documents across Sarah's desk. 43 families applied this year. Sarah reviewed the applications, reading about children whose parents had been killed in action, spouses who were struggling to support families on military survivor benefits, young people who dreamed of college but lacked the financial resources to achieve their goals. Each application represented a family that had paid the price for America's security, people who deserved support from the country their loved ones had died serving. "We can fund 12 full scholarships this year," Sarah said, calculating the foundation's available resources. "Maybe 15 if we find additional donors." The foundation had grown beyond what either woman had imagined when they'd first established it. Corporate sponsors, individual donors, and government grants had provided enough funding to support dozens of military families, while also financing research into protective technologies and training improvements. "There's something else," Dr. Vasquez said, producing a thick folder from her briefcase. "The Pentagon wants us to brief Congress about the biological weapons threat and how our experience can inform future policy." Sarah felt the familiar mixture of pride and anxiety that came with high-level recognition. The mission to extract Dr. Vasquez remained classified, but their subsequent work on defensive measures and operational security had gained attention from senior officials who understood the value of their unique perspective. "When?" "Next month. Closed session with the House and Senate Intelligence Committees." It would mean explaining to elected officials how a single security breach had nearly led to a biological weapons attack on American cities, and how the lessons learned from that near catastrophe could prevent future threats. Some of the details would have to remain classified, but they could provide enough information to help policymakers understand the stakes involved. That afternoon, Sarah drove to Arlington National Cemetery for her monthly visit to her teammates' graves. It had become a ritual, a way of staying connected to the people who'd shaped her understanding of service and sacrifice. The cemetery was quieter than usual, with only a few other visitors scattered among the white headstones. Sarah made her way to the section where Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez were buried, each grave marked with flowers from family members and fellow veterans who remembered their service. She found Hayes's grave first, noting that someone had left fresh flowers, probably his wife, who still visited regularly despite having remarried the previous year. Sarah had attended the wedding, a small ceremony that had been both joyful and bittersweet, celebrating new love while honoring the memory of the man who'd made it possible. "The kids are doing well," Sarah said quietly, speaking to the headstone as if Hayes could hear her. "Michael just started high school, and he's playing football. Rachel made honor roll again, and Jenny is learning to play piano." She'd stayed in touch with Hayes's family, attending school plays and birthday parties, serving as a connection to their father's military service. The children had grown up understanding that their father had died protecting other people, though they wouldn't learn the classified details until they were much older. At Martinez's grave, she left a small flag from Puerto Rico honoring his heritage and his family's long tradition of military service. His mother had asked Sarah to speak at a veterans event in San Juan the previous year, and Sarah had been moved by the pride and resilience of the military family she'd met there. Thompson's headstone was decorated with flowers from his high school sweetheart, now married to someone else but still honoring the memory of her first love. Chun's grave had offerings that reflected his Chinese-American heritage, while Rodriguez's was surrounded by the kind of elaborate floral arrangements that spoke to his large, close-knit family. Standing among the graves, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the survivor, the one who carried their stories and their sacrifice into the future. But she also felt something else, a sense of purpose that had grown stronger over the past 3 years as she'd learned to channel her grief into constructive action. 5 years Later, Sarah stood in the rose garden behind her house in Virginia, watching her nephew Michael, now 8 years old, chase his younger sister Lucy around the carefully tended flower beds. Emma and Jim had brought the children for Sunday dinner, a monthly tradition that had become one of the highlights of Sarah's civilian life. "Aunt Sarah, tell us about the Navy again," Michael demanded, collapsing dramatically on a bench beside her. "What do you want to know? Did you really drive submarines?" Sarah smiled, remembering when she'd tried to explain her military service to a 4-year-old who thought all Navy personnel worked on submarines. "No, I didn't drive submarines. I was in the SEALs, which means I specialized in missions on land. At sea and in the air. Like a superhero. Like a very well-trained soldier who worked with other very well-trained soldiers to protect people." Lucy, who was 5 and possessed of the fierce independence that seemed to run in their family, climbed onto the bench beside her brother. "Mom says you saved people," she announced. "I tried to. Sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I didn't. But the important thing was that I worked with a team of people who all cared about protecting others." Emma joined them in the garden, carrying a tray of lemonade and looking more relaxed than Sarah had seen her in years. Her sister had found her calling as a teacher, and she'd recently been promoted to principal of her elementary school. "Kids, go wash your hands for dinner," Emma instructed. "Aunt Sarah and I need to talk about grown-up things." After the children had raced toward the house, Emma sat down beside her sister on the bench. "I have news," she said with barely contained excitement. "Good news, I hope. The best. Jim got the promotion. We're moving to Colorado next month." Sarah felt a complex mixture of happiness for her sister and sadness at the prospect of seeing less of her nephew and niece. The children had become an important part of her life, connecting her to a world beyond military service and classified briefings. "That's wonderful," she said, meaning it despite her mixed feelings. "Jim deserves the recognition. There's something else. We want you to be Lucy's godmother." Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. Being named as Michael's godmother had been an honor that had helped her process her grief over the loss of her teammates. Now, being asked to take the same role in Lucy's life felt like recognition of how much she'd grown and changed since returning from Afghanistan. "I'd be honored." That evening, after Emma's family had returned home, Sarah sat in her study reviewing applications for the latest round of Foundation scholarships. The program had expanded to include not just military families, but also the children of intelligence officers, diplomats, and other government personnel who died in service to their country. Among the applications was one from Elena Vasquez, who was requesting funding for a research project that would develop new protective equipment for special operations forces. The biochemist had become one of the Foundation's most valued advisors, using her expertise to ensure that their research grants addressed real operational needs. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her review of the applications. "Sarah Reeves, Commander. This is Colonel Peterson at SOCOM. We have a situation that requires your expertise." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with unexpected mission calls, followed immediately by the reminder that her active duty days were behind her. "What kind of situation?" "Intelligence breach. Someone's been feeding classified information to hostile forces, and we need your help identifying the source." The irony wasn't lost on her 8 years after Morrison's betrayal. The military was still struggling with insider threats and security vulnerabilities. "When do you need me?" "Tomorrow morning." "This one's big, Commander. Potentially bigger than Morrison." After the call ended, Sarah sat quietly in her study, surrounded by the mementos of her military career. Commendations, photographs, and flags shared space with family pictures and academic texts, representing the different aspects of her life that she'd learned to balance over the past 5 years. The teaching position at Quantico had evolved into something larger. She'd become the military's leading expert on counterintelligence and operational security, consulted by agencies across the government when insider threats were discovered. It was work that drew on her operational experience while allowing her to maintain the stable, predictable life she'd built in Virginia. But calls like tonight's reminded her that the world remained dangerous, that there were still people willing to betray their country for money or ideology, and that her unique expertise was sometimes the only thing standing between security and catastrophe. 10 years later, the auditorium at the Naval War College was packed with senior military officers, intelligence officials, and congressional staffers who'd come to hear Sarah's keynote address at the annual Counterintelligence Symposium. At 47, she'd become one of the most respected voices in the intelligence community, known for her practical approach to security threats and her ability to translate operational experience into policy recommendations. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, looking out at an audience that included many of the people she'd trained and mentored over the past decade. 20 years ago, I lost my entire team because someone we trusted decided that money was more important than loyalty. Today, I want to talk about how we've learned from that betrayal and what we still need to do to protect our people. The presentation covered case studies from dozens of investigations she'd led, patterns of behavior that could indicate insider threats, and technological solutions that could prevent future betrayals. But it also included something more personal, her reflection on how the loss of her teammates had shaped her understanding of leadership and responsibility. In the audience, she could see Dr. Elena Vasquez, now a senior advisor to the Department of Homeland Security and one of the country's leading experts on biological weapons threats. Beside her sat Mike Torres, who'd retired from the CIA the previous year and was now teaching at Georgetown University. The three of them had remained close, bound together by their shared experience and their ongoing commitment to preventing the kind of catastrophe they'd helped avert in Afghanistan. They met regularly, formally as members of various advisory committees, and informally as friends who understood each other in ways that few others could. After the presentation, Sarah joined a reception where she found herself surrounded by young officers who wanted to hear about her experiences and learn from her insights. She answered their questions patiently, remembering how eager she'd been for guidance from experienced officers when she was their age. Commander Reeves, one of them, said, a young lieutenant with the kind of intense focus that reminded Sarah of herself 20 years earlier. What advice would you give to someone just starting out in special operations? Sarah considered the question, thinking about all the lessons she'd learned and the prices that had been paid for that knowledge. Remember that your teammates are the most important thing, she said finally. Equipment can be replaced, missions can be replanned, but your people are irreplaceable. Take care of them, trust them, and never forget that everything you do affects not just your own safety, but theirs. Later that evening, Sarah drove to her house in Annapolis, where she'd moved after retiring from active duty the previous year. The transition to civilian life had been easier than she'd expected, partly because her consulting work kept her connected to the military community, and partly because she'd learned to build a life that extended beyond her professional identity. Her house was filled with reminders of that broader life, photographs from Emma's children's graduations and weddings, artwork created by the scholarship recipients the foundation had supported, letters from families who'd been helped by the program she'd established. On her desk was a recent letter from Hayes' son Michael, now a Marine Corps lieutenant serving his first deployment in the Pacific. He'd written to thank her for the guidance she'd provided over the years, and to let her know that he was planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned home. You taught me what it means to serve something larger than yourself, he'd written. Dad would be proud of the man I've become, and I know that's partly because of your influence. Sarah kept the letter in a frame beside a photograph of his father, a reminder that the impact of service extended far beyond individual missions or careers. The values that Hayes had embodied loyalty, courage, Commitment to others lived on in his son and in the countless other people who'd been influenced by his example. 15 years. Later, the Veterans Day ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery drew thousands of visitors. But Sarah had arrived early to spend time at her teammates' graves before the crowds gathered. At 52, she moved more slowly than she had during her operational days. But she was still strong, still engaged, still committed to honoring the memory of the people who'd shaped her. Understanding of service. Hayes's grave was decorated with flowers from his grandchildren, who'd grown up hearing stories about their grandfather's service, but were only now beginning to understand the full scope of his sacrifice. Michael had followed his father into military service and was now a major in the Marine Corps, while his sisters had become a doctor and a teacher respectively. The foundation funded its 1,000th scholarship last month, Sarah told Hayes's headstone, continuing her monthly reports on the programs they'd established in his memory. A young woman from Texas whose father was killed in Syria. She wants to study international relations and work in the State Department. The foundation had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined, supporting not just scholarships but also research programs, family support services, and policy initiatives that addressed the needs of military families. Sarah had stepped back from day-to-day operations the previous year, but she remained actively involved in strategic planning and major decisions. Standing among the graves, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this point. The mission that had cost her teammates their lives had ultimately led to a career focused on preventing similar tragedies, protecting future generations of service members from the kind of betrayal that had killed Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez. The work had been meaningful, but it had also been costly. She'd never married, never had children of her own, choosing instead to channel her nurturing instincts into mentoring young officers and supporting military families. It had been a conscious choice, made with full awareness of what she was giving up, but sometimes she wondered what her life might have been like if she'd chosen differently. As she prepared to leave the cemetery, Sarah noticed a young woman standing beside Rodriguez's grave, tears streaming down her face. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, with the kind of bearing that suggested military training. "Excuse me," Sarah said gently. "Are you family?" The young woman turned, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm his daughter, Maria. Second Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez, Army Intelligence." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She remembered Rodriguez talking about his daughter during their mission planning sessions, how proud he was that she was following in his footsteps despite his concerns about the dangers of military service. "I'm Sarah Reeves," she said. "I served with your father." Maria's eyes widened with recognition. "Your ghost. Dad talked about you all the time. He said you were the toughest soldier he'd ever met." They stood together beside Rodriguez's grave. Two generations of warriors connected by their shared loss and their commitment to service. Sarah told Maria stories about her father that weren't in any official reports. His sense of humor, his loyalty to his teammates, his pride in his daughters. Achievements. "He died believing in something important," Sarah said as their conversation drew to a close. "And that belief lives on in you." Walking back to her car, Sarah thought about the cycles of service that connected each generation to the next. Rodriguez's daughter would face different challenges than her father had, but she would face them with the same commitment to something larger than herself. The mission that had begun in an Afghan compound 15 years earlier continued in new forms, carried forward by people who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and that some things were worth any sacrifice. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez had died for that understanding, but their legacy lived on in every person they'd influenced, every family they'd protected, every young officer who chose service over safety. As Sarah drove away from the cemetery, she thought about the phone call she'd received that morning from Dr. Vasquez, who'd been asked to brief the president about emerging biological weapons threats. The work they'd begun together in that laboratory complex continued to evolve, adapting to new technologies and new dangers, but always guided by the lessons they'd learned from their shared ordeal. The world remained dangerous, but it was safer. Because people like Sarah continued to serve, continued to train others, continued to honor the memory of those who'd paid the ultimate price for security and freedom. Their sacrifice had meaning because it lived on in the actions of those who remained, creating a legacy that extended far beyond any individual mission or operation. 20 years later, the memorial service for Dr. Elena Vasquez was held on a crisp autumn morning at Arlington National Cemetery, with representatives from across the intelligence and scientific communities gathered to honor a woman who dedicated her life to protecting others from biological weapons threats. Sarah, now 62 and walking with a slight limp from an old training injury, served as one of the speakers. Elena Vasquez understood that knowledge could be either a weapon or a shield, Sarah told the assembled mourners. She chose to make it a shield, using her expertise to protect innocent people from those who would use science to cause harm. Dr. Vasquez had died peacefully in her sleep the previous week, after a long battle with cancer that she'd faced with the same quiet courage she'd shown during her captivity 25 years earlier. She'd never married, dedicating herself entirely to her research and to the foundation they'd established together. In her will, Dr. Vasquez had left everything to the foundation, endowing it with enough resources to continue its work indefinitely. She'd also left a personal message for Sarah, thanking her for the friendship that had sustained them both through the aftermath of their shared trauma. "You saved my life twice," the letter read. "Once in that compound, and again by showing me how to build a meaningful life from the wreckage of what we'd both lost." After the service, Sarah joined Mike Torres for lunch at a restaurant near the Pentagon. The former CIA operative was now in his late 60s, retired from government service, but still active as a consultant and author. He'd written 3 books about counterintelligence, though the most important parts of his story remained classified. "Elena was one of the good ones," he said, raising his glass in a toast to their departed friend. "She was the best," Sarah agreed. "Everything we accomplished over the past 25 years started with her courage in that laboratory." They spent the afternoon reminiscing about their friend and colleague, sharing stories that would never appear in any official history, but that captured the essence of who Dr. Vasquez had been. Her scientific brilliance had been matched by her moral courage, her willingness to risk everything to prevent others from suffering. That evening, Sarah returned to her apartment in Georgetown, where she'd moved after selling her house in Annapolis. The smaller space suited her current lifestyle. She traveled frequently for speaking engagements and consulting work, and she no longer needed room for the large gatherings she'd once hosted. Her study was lined with photographs spanning 4 decades of service official portraits from her SEAL days, candid shots from training exercises, formal ceremonies recognizing various achievements. But the center of the display was reserved for a single photograph of her 6 teammates from that final mission, taken during a training exercise just weeks before their deployment to Afghanistan. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, Rodriguez, and herself, all young and confident and absolutely certain that they were invincible. Looking at the photograph now, Sarah could see the future in their faces, the sacrifices they'd make, the prices they'd pay, the legacy they'd leave for others to carry forward. Her phone rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller ID showed a number she recognized: the Foundation's current director, a former Army intelligence officer named Captain Lisa Park, who'd taken over day-to-day operations when Sarah had stepped back. "We have a problem," Captain Park said without preamble. "The State Department is asking us to consult on a situation in Eastern Europe. Someone's been selling biological weapons technology to terrorist groups." Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, followed by the reminder that she was no longer the person who responded to such crises directly. Her role now was advisory, providing guidance and context based on decades of experience. What kind of consultation do they need? Risk assessment and threat analysis. They want to know how serious this is and what can be done to stop it. Send me the briefing materials. I'll review them tonight and have recommendations by tomorrow morning. After the call ended, Sarah sat quietly in her study, surrounded by the artifacts of a life spent in service to others. The work continued, the threats evolved, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: protecting innocent people from those who would use knowledge and technology to cause harm. She thought about Dr. Vasquez, who'd faced that challenge with quiet determination until the very end. She thought about her fallen teammates, whose sacrifice had prevented one catastrophe, and whose memory continued to inspire others to serve. She thought about the hundreds of young officers she'd trained and mentored over the years, who were now carrying forward the values and lessons that had been paid for with blood. The mission that had begun in an Afghan compound 30 years earlier continued in new forms, adapted to new threats, but guided by the same principles that had motivated Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez. Their legacy lived on not in monuments or official histories, but in the daily actions of people who understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. As Sarah prepared for bed, she performed a ritual that had sustained her for 25 years. She read the names of her fallen teammates aloud, honoring their memory and renewing her commitment to the ideals they'd died defending. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, Rodriguez, she said quietly, never forgotten. Outside her window, the lights of Washington, D.C. sparkled in the darkness, representing millions of people who slept safely because others had chosen to stand guard. The work would continue tomorrow, carried forward by a new generation of guardians who understood that freedom required constant vigilance and that some things were worth protecting at any cost. The cycle of service continued, connecting each generation to the next through shared sacrifice and common purpose. The mission was never complete, the threat never fully eliminated, but the commitment remained unchanged to serve something larger than oneself, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to ensure that the price paid by earlier generations had not been paid in vain. 25 years later, the ceremony at the Pentagon was Sarah's final official appearance as a government consultant. At 67, she was stepping back from all professional responsibilities, though she would continue to serve on the Foundation's board and provide informal mentorship to young officers who sought her guidance. For more than 4 decades, Sarah "Ghost" Reeves has embodied the highest ideals of military service. Secretary of Defense Williams said as he presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, her contributions to national security, operational training, and the welfare of military families have made our nation safer and stronger. In the audience, Sarah could see many of the people who'd been shaped by her influence: former students who'd risen to senior positions, Foundation Scholarship recipients who, in the audience, Sarah could see many of the people who'd been shaped by her influence: former students who'd risen to senior positions, Foundation Scholarship recipients who'd become doctors and teachers and engineers, family members of her fallen teammates who'd found ways to honor their loved ones, sacrificed through service to others. Emma sat in the front row, now a grandmother herself, beaming with pride at her sister's recognition. Beside her were Michael and Lucy, both successful adults who'd grown up understanding that their aunt had dedicated her life to protecting others. Michael had followed the military tradition, retiring as a colonel after 30 years of service, while Lucy had become a pediatric surgeon, saving lives in a different but equally meaningful way. After the ceremony, Sarah stood alone for a moment. In the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, surrounded by portraits of recipients of the Medal of Honor and other high decorations, she thought about the young woman who'd first enlisted in the Navy 47 years earlier, driven by a restless need to serve something larger than herself. That young woman could never have imagined the path that lay ahead. The missions completed and lost, The teammates who'd become family and then become memories. The decades spent turning tragedy into purpose. The journey had cost her everything she'd once thought she wanted and given her everything she'd never known she needed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Rodriguez, now a brigadier general and one of the Army's most respected intelligence officers. Thank you for everything you taught me about honor and service. Dad would be proud of who we've all become. Sarah smiled, thinking about Rodriguez and the 5 other men who died in that Afghan compound 30 years ago. Their sacrifice had rippled forward through time, influencing hundreds of people who'd influenced thousands more, creating a legacy of service that extended far beyond any individual mission or operation. As she walked out of the Pentagon for the last time as an official consultant, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The work would continue, threats would evolve, new guardians would step forward. The eternal vigilance required by freedom would be maintained by others. But her part in that great endeavor was transitioning to a new phase. That evening, she sat in her study one final time as an active participant in the intelligence community, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of a life spent in service to others. Tomorrow, she would begin writing her memoirs, not the classified operational details that would remain secret for decades, but the human story of what it meant to serve, to lose, to continue fighting for ideals that were worth any sacrifice. She opened her laptop and began typing. The gunfire had stopped 3 minutes ago, but Lieutenant Commander Sarah "Ghost" Reeves could still taste cordite in the air. The story that had begun in tragedy would end in triumph, not the simple victory of a mission completed, but the deeper triumph of a life lived with purpose, of sacrifice transformed into service, of memory preserved through the actions of those who remained. Hayes, Martinez, Thompson, Chun, and Rodriguez lived on in every person they'd influenced, every family they'd protected, every young officer who chose service over safety. Their legacy was not carved in stone, but written in the daily choices of people who understood that some things were worth defending at any cost. The mission continued, as it always would, carried forward by new hands but guided by timeless principles. And Sarah Reeves, the ghost who'd survived to tell their story, could finally rest knowing that their sacrifice had meaning that would endure long after the last witness was gone. Thank you for following Sarah's incredible journey. Stories like this take considerable time and effort to craft. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and sacrifice, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others who appreciate stories of heroism and service.